My name is Roberta, and for as long as I can remember, I've worked at my parents' tableware store. We sell everything from fancy dinner plates to the kind of mugs you use for your morning coffee. It's a family business through and through. The day everything started to change was just like any other, except for when Mrs. Wilson from the bakery next door stormed into our store. She had this way of busting in like she owned the place. "John," she bellowed, not even a foot into the shop. "I need to speak with you, now." Her voice could slice through concrete. I was rearranging some ceramic teapots we'd just got in, but I paused to watch the scene unfold. Dad wiped his hands on his apron and shot me a look that said, "Here we go again." "Sure thing, Beverly. What's stirring?" Dad always tried to stay cheerful around her, but you could tell he was bracing himself. Mrs. Wilson glanced around, her eyes finally landing on me. "This is family business, Roberta. Mind giving us a minute?" Her tone rubbed me the wrong way, but I shrugged it off and wandered over to the other side of the store, pretending to fix an already perfect display of dinner sets. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried over the shelves. "I'll cut to the chase, John. My bakery and your store have been neighbors for years. It's time we think bigger. What do you say to merging our businesses?" Her voice was all business, serious. Dad coughed, a little taken aback. "Merge, huh? That's a hefty suggestion, Beverly. What's got this idea in your head now?" "Not just that," she continued, lowering her voice so I had to strain to hear. "I think our kids could make this even more beneficial. If Roberta and Lucas were to tie the knot, it'd solidify the deal." I almost dropped a teapot. Mary Lucas? The Lucas I knew was her son, sure, but he was 10 years older than me, and we'd barely exchanged 2 words, despite being neighbors. I peeked around the aisle and saw Dad scratching his head, clearly in deep thought. "Lucas is a good lad, and Roberta's a bright girl," Dad finally said. "But marriage? They hardly know each other, Beverly. They'll get along. Trust me. Plus, it makes good business sense, doesn't it?" There was a sharpness in her voice, like she was used to getting her way. Dad nodded slowly. "I'll talk it over with the missus. And Roberta, of course." When Mrs. Wilson left, Dad called me over. "Roberta, you heard all that, didn't you?" I nodded, not sure what to make of it. "She wants to merge the store and the bakery, and she wants me to marry Lucas?" "Yeah," Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you think? I know it's a lot to take in." Marrying for business sounded like something out of an old movie, not something I'd ever imagined for myself. I don't know, Dad. Lucas seems nice, but marry him? Just like that? You should meet him, properly this time. See if you two click. No pressure to decide right now. We'll take this step by step. Lucas and I spent the next few months getting to know each other. I found that he wasn't just well-mannered, he had a genuine side to him that cared about the business as much as his mother did, but in a less overbearing way. Our conversations often drifted from business to personal, which made the whole situation seem less like a contract and more like a potential relationship. The wedding planning, though, that was a whole other beast. Mrs. Wilson, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, took over everything. From the cake from her bakery to the decorations that looked like they belonged in one of her display windows. One afternoon, as we were going over the guest list, she barged into the room with a stack of invitations so thick you'd think we were summoning the whole town. "Roberta, dear, I've added a few names to your guest list. People important to our business. It's crucial they're there," she announced, dropping the stack on the table with a thud that made me jump. I bit my tongue, not wanting to start a fight. Lucas saw this and squeezed my hand under the table. "We'll sort it out, Robbie. It's our day, remember?" The day of the wedding was a blur. I stood at the back of the hall in my dress, feeling more like a prop in Mrs. Wilson's grand business scheme than a bride. My dad came up to me, his smile a little forced. "You look beautiful, Roberta. Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." The ceremony went by in a rush, and before I knew it, Lucas and I were pronounced husband and wife. The reception was loud, filled with Mrs. Wilson's guests, who talked more about the potential of our joint ventures than our nuptials. The merger was completed soon after the wedding. Both shops were knocked into one big space, with a section for the bakery and another for the tableware. The first day we opened the combined store, Mrs. Wilson was everywhere, directing staff like a general. "Roberta, dear, make sure those plates are aligned with the pastries. Symmetry sells," she called out across the store. I adjusted the plates, trying to follow her exacting standards. Lucas was in the bakery section, trying to coordinate with the bakers. "Make sure those scones are fresh. Roberta, how's it going over there?" he shouted over the noise. "Trying to keep up with your mom's symmetry mantra," I shouted back, a hint of frustration in my voice. But as weeks turned into months, the workload only got heavier. Between running the front of the store, helping in the bakery, and all the paperwork, I found myself unable to keep up with my college classes. "Roberta, you're running a business now, you won't need that degree. This is your life," Mrs. Wilson declared one evening, her tone dismissive as if the matter was already decided. Her words, sharp and final, hit me harder than I expected. Living with them was supposed to save us money and make managing the business easier, she argued. It just meant longer hours for me, since we were just a short walk from the store. The lack of personal space and constant oversight from Mrs. Wilson suffocated me, making each day harder than the last. What started as a partnership increasingly felt like a takeover. Meanwhile, I noticed something else that troubled me more than I expected. My dad was around less and less. One particularly busy Tuesday morning, as I was setting up the store before opening, I couldn't help but feel the emptiness of his absence. It used to be that he'd be here by now, sharing a joke or two to kick off the day. Instead, it was just me and the clinking of ceramics. That evening, after a long day of dealing with customers and Mrs. Wilson's incessant directions, I visited my parents. The air in their living room felt heavier than usual, like there were words hanging in it that no one dared to speak. "Dad, why aren't you at the store much anymore?" I asked as soon as I sat down. The direct approach felt necessary. My dad looked up, a frown creasing his forehead. "Well, Roberta, it's complicated. Beverly has, well, she's taken over more than we expected." My mom chimed in from across the room, her voice sharp with worry. "She's pushed your father out, Roberta. That contract we signed, it wasn't just a merger. It's like we handed her the keys to the kingdom." My stomach twisted into knots. "What do you mean? Dad, you've always handled the orders and the suppliers." He sighed, his hands clasped tightly together. "Not anymore. Beverly rewrote the job roles. Legally, I'm just a consultant now, barely that. I don't have a say in the business I built." Anger flared up inside me, hot and fierce. "Why didn't you say anything? We thought we could handle it, sort it out without worrying you," my mom said, her eyes sad. "But it's clear we can't. She's taking everything we've worked for, Roberta." The next day, I confronted Mrs. Wilson. It was early, just as the morning light began spilling into the store. She was arranging some pastries, her back to me as I walked in. "Mrs. Wilson, we need to talk about my dad," I said, my voice firm, louder than I intended. She turned around, her expression one of mock surprise. "Oh? What about him, dear?" "You know what I'm talking about. You're pushing him out of his own business. Why are you doing this?" I demanded. Mrs. Wilson straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron as she faced me. "Roberta, your father is getting older. He can't handle the stress of the business. It's better for everyone this way. I'm making things more efficient." "That's not your call to make," I shot back. "He built this place. You can't just sideline him because you think it's better." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Business is tough, Roberta. It's not about sentimental value, it's about keeping the ship afloat. I'm doing what's necessary. When the pandemic hit, it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under us. Sales at the store plummeted. Every day, the empty aisle stared back at me, a grim reminder that things were bad and might get worse. It was during one of those quiet, worrying shifts that I decided we couldn't just sit around waiting for normal to return. Lucas, we have to pivot to online. We can set up delivery, maybe start taking individual orders, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Lucas looked skeptical, but nodded. It's worth a shot. Let's talk to Mom about it. I knew convincing Mrs. Wilson would be an uphill battle. She had her ways set in stone and viewed online sales as a risky venture. True to form, when we brought it up, she dismissed it outright. We're not some tech startup. We're a brick-and-mortar business. We'll wait this out, she declared, cutting off any further discussion. But I couldn't just stand by and watch everything we'd built crumble to dust. So, I started something on the down low. After hours, I used our store's resources to build an online community. I sold dishes from the store and took to baking cakes after the bakery closed for the day. Orders began to trickle in, then flood. Keeping this from Lucas and Mrs. Wilson was exhausting. I was burning the candle at both ends, managing our secret online sales and my day job at the store. Nights turned into mornings, and I found myself sneaking back home well past midnight on many occasions. One night, as I tiptoed in, trying not to wake anyone, I found Mrs. Wilson waiting in the living room, her arms folded and her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "Where have you been, Roberta? Look at the state of this house," she snapped, her voice low but fierce. "I've been working, Mrs. Wilson. We got a rush of online orders tonight," I replied, my voice weary from too many long nights. "Online orders? What online orders?" Her voice rose, sharp and accusing. Before I could explain, Lucas came down, drawn by the noise. "Mom, what's going on? Ask your wife what's going on. She's running some secret side business and neglecting her duties around here," Mrs. Wilson shot back, glaring at me. Lucas turned to me, confusion and frustration written all over his face. "Roberta, what's she talking about?" I sighed, the fatigue of the last few weeks catching up to me. "I started an online store. It's been keeping us afloat since the pandemic started. I didn't tell you because your mom said no, and I didn't think she'd go for it." Lucas rubbed his temples, looking between his mom and me. "You should have told me, Roberta. And you," he turned to his mom, "should have been more open to her ideas." Mrs. Wilson's face hardened. "This is my house, and while you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules. Both of you." The argument spiraled from there. Lucas, usually my ally, sided with his mom this time. "Roberta, you need to balance your time better. Help out more around here." Defeated and heartbroken that Lucas didn't see how hard I was trying to save our business, I cut back on the online orders. I started spending my mornings cleaning the house instead of preparing shipments or baking. My afternoons were spent running the pastry counter, a reminder of what I had to scale back on to keep peace in the house. It was a dreary, rain-soaked afternoon, and I was straightening up the store hall when the door creaked open. A little girl, about 8 years old, stumbled in. Her clothes were drenched, sticking to her skin, and she was crying, her face streaked with tears. I rushed over to her, setting aside the stack of plates I was arranging. "Hey there, what happened? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound as gentle as I could. Before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson spotted us from the end of the aisle. She marched over, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this? Roberta, we don't have time for this today. She looks like a beggar. Put her out before others see." My stomach twisted at her words. "She's just a child, Mrs. Wilson. She's clearly lost and needs help." Lucas came over, having overheard his mother. His face was unreadable as he glanced at the girl then back at me. "Roberta, Mom's right. We can't have kids like her running into the store. It's not good for business. Just handle it, okay?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Lucas, she's scared and alone. We can't just throw her back out into the rain. Ignoring them both, I took the girl to a chair and wrapped her in a clean blanket from the back room. I made her a cup of hot chocolate, hoping to calm her down a bit. Mrs. Wilson was fuming. This is exactly the kind of distraction we don't need. Roberta, you're responsible for any fallout from this. The girl managed to calm down enough to tell me her name was Sophie. She had wandered off from a park nearby and gotten lost. Just as she started to relax, the police arrived. They thanked me for looking after Sophie and told me her parents had been frantically looking for her. Turns out, she wasn't far from home after all. After the police and Sophie left, Mrs. Wilson pulled me aside, her face stern and cold. Because of your little stunt, I'm fining you. You took time away from your work to deal with this situation. You'll wash dishes for the next 2 days to make up for it. Lucas just nodded along with whatever his mom said, not once standing up for me. It stung more than I expected. That night, as I scrubbed pot after pot, my mind raced. I felt more like a servant than a part of the family. Lucas's support had always been my rock, but now he was just another weight dragging me down. Each harsh word from Mrs. Wilson, each nod of agreement from Lucas, was a reminder of how trapped I felt. It was another ordinary morning at the store when this richly dressed man walked in, looking around like he was searching for something special. I greeted him and asked if I could help him find anything. He nodded and explained he was looking for a high-end tea set. I showed him our finest collection, and he seemed impressed, selecting one of our most expensive sets. While I wrapped up his purchase, he browsed our pastry section and picked out an assortment of treats. The whole time, he had this kind demeanor about him, making small talk and asking about the store's history. After ringing up his purchases, he thanked me and then paused, his expression turning a bit more serious. By the way, I'm not sure if you remember, but my daughter was the little girl you helped out last week, the one who got lost in the storm. I was taken aback, not expecting this twist. Of course, I remember. She was such a brave little girl. I'm glad I could help her. He smiled warmly and handed me his business card. Well, I'm really grateful for what you did. If you ever need anything, advice, or help with anything at all, just give me a call, he said. I looked at the card and noticed he was a lawyer, Mr. Hayes. That caught my attention, considering the mess with the store and the merger. Actually, there might be something. Could we maybe talk about a legal matter? It's about the business my father used to own with my mother-in-law. Of course, he replied with an encouraging nod. Why don't you come by my office next week? We can go over everything in detail. I took him up on his offer, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. At his office, I handed him the pile of documents my dad had signed years ago, the ones that merged our family store with my mother-in-law's bakery. He went through them carefully, his brow furrowing more with each page. After a long silence, Mr. Hayes looked up. There are several significant issues here. The contract has multiple violations that are quite concerning. I think we have a strong case if you want to challenge this. He offered to help me pro bono, to make things right, he said. I was overwhelmed but grateful. Thank you, I'd like that. It's just hard, you know? It's my husband's family too. He understood my hesitation. It's not just about business, it's about your life. You deserve to have control over that, and you're not alone in this fight. I left his office feeling a mix of hope and dread. Could I really go against my husband and his mother? But then, what was the alternative? Living under Mrs. Wilson's thumb, watching the store my parents built from scratch being mismanaged? I walked into our house that evening, my mind still spinning from my meeting with the lawyer. I wasn't prepared for the scene that greeted me. The place was bustling, filled with guests laughing and talking, glasses clinking. I paused, taking it all in, when my mother-in-law, slightly tipsy, spotted me. There you are. Wandering the streets when you should be here serving your guests, she bellowed across the room. It's your anniversary, Roberta. Have you no sense of duty? I froze, my anniversary completely slipping my mind amidst the chaos of recent events. I'm sorry, I forgot. I stammered, feeling every eye in the room turn towards me. My apology did nothing to soothe her. In a fit of anger, she grabbed a nearby pizza box and hurled it at me, the box grazing my shoulder before tumbling to the ground. Useless. Absolutely useless, she shouted, her face red with fury. Before I could recover, Lucas, also showing signs of having had too much to drink, stumbled over to me. And look at you, not even ready to eat. Wash up, for heaven's sake. He slurred, sloshing wine from his glass onto my hands and clothes in a mocking gesture. The wine stained my shirt, dripping cold and unwelcome against my skin. Something inside me snapped. The humiliation, the disrespect, the sheer injustice of how they were treating me, it all boiled over. I wiped my hands on my stained shirt and faced the room, my voice steady and loud. Enough, I declared, silencing the room. I've been to a lawyer. I am getting a divorce, Lucas. The room fell completely silent. Lucas and his mother looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. Who do you think you are? My mother-in-law hissed, stepping closer. You think you can just... I'm not finished. I cut her off, my voice ringing clear. I'm challenging the merger of the store. There's been fraud, and I've already sent the documents to the authorities and to court. Lucas staggered slightly, his earlier bravado fading. Roberta, you can't mean this. I am also seeking financial compensation for everything I've endured here, I continued, ignoring his disbelief. The shock was palpable. Murmurs started to rise among the guests as my declaration sunk in. I didn't wait for more questions or for the situation to escalate further. I turned on my heel and headed upstairs to pack my things. My mother-in-law followed, her tone shifting to desperation. Roberta, please, let's talk about this. You're overreacting. I stopped, turned, and faced her one last time. Without a word, I handed her the lawyer's business card. From now on, any communication goes through my lawyer, I said firmly. With that, I went to our room, my hands shaking, but my resolve firm. I packed quickly, only essentials, only what I needed to start anew. I finally moved out of my mother-in-law's house and into a small apartment across town. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in years. I was on my own now, but I wasn't alone, my dad was with me, and together we were fighting to take back what was rightfully ours. My lawyer, Mr. Hayes, worked tirelessly on our case. He was a bulldog in the courtroom, fighting against the fraudulent merger my mother-in-law had orchestrated years ago. It wasn't long before we received the news we had been hoping for. The court ruled in our favor. They found Mrs. Wilson guilty of fraud and overturned the merger. Additionally, they imposed a hefty fine on her and awarded me financial compensation. The compensation was just enough to buy out her share in the business, a combined bakery and tableware store that my dad and I once ran together. It felt surreal to stand in front of the shop, now fully ours again, without the shadow of Mrs. Wilson looming over us. Dad, we did it. It's ours again, I said, handing him the new keys to the store. We spent the next few weeks renovating the store, making it ours again. Every new coat of paint, every display rearranged, felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul that I had lost. Mrs. Wilson and Lucas were forced to find other jobs. The court costs and the fine took everything they had saved. I heard rumors about their struggles, but I kept my distance. Lucas tried to reach out once or twice, but I didn't respond. That part of my life was closed. I was focused on the future now. With the store back under our control, I resumed my college studies. I enrolled in night classes, determined to finish my degree. Sitting in a classroom again, I felt hope, a stark contrast to the despair I had felt under Mrs. Wilson's roof. One evening, after closing the shop, my dad and I sat at one of the tables, sharing a pot of coffee. You know, Roberta, starting over like this, it's more than I could have asked for, Dad said, looking around the shop fondly. I feel the same, Dad. It's like I finally woke up from a long, bad dream. We have a second chance here, and I'm not going to waste it, I replied, feeling a strength in my words that I hadn't felt in years. We talked about plans for the future, new products we could introduce, holiday sales to prepare for, and community events we could sponsor. It was exciting, invigorating, and I loved every minute of it.